Good morning. Well, thank you, Sue. Now they really expect this to be a dynamic talk. In the first service, I kind of blubbered my way through it, so I hope I'm feeling powerful right now. And if I'm not, just go, okay. She's doing. For those of you who are new with us from out of town, Chico, oh, bless you for being here. Just bless you for being here. And Sue and I are co-ministers, and she's the one that cries and is teaching me to cry, and I'm the one that does spreadsheets, and I'm trying to teach her that. So we make a good pair. And I'm not going to tell you this till the end, but okay. So the topic is the blind leading the blind. And you know what the rest of that is. If the blind lead the blind, they fall into a ditch. What a great topic. Okay, it comes from Matthew 15:14. If the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. You know, I've heard this many times, and for this talk, I pulled out my Bible, and I took time to read it, 15:14. And it's an interesting story. It's about the scribes and the Pharisees when they came to Jerusalem to meet Jesus. And they asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they do not wash their hands before they eat bread?" In the Bible days, there were all these rules of do's and do nots, and what to eat, what not to eat, and a great emphasis was placed on washing your hands. And the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day put a lot of importance in these rules. And it became easy for many of them to believe as long as they were abiding by the rules, they were good with God, regardless of what they actually did. So when asked why his disciples were not washing their hands before eating bread, Jesus said, "Why do you also transgress the commandments of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, 'Honor your father and mother, and he who curses their father and mother, let them be put to death.'" Now, there was no response in the Bible. I think there must have been this quietness. But to Jesus, the attitude of the scribes and the Pharisees was an example of the blind leading the blind. It was focusing on their outward expression of religion when caring more about what others thought of them. And when we do that, when we forget about our beliefs and we want people to admire us, then we're blind, and the people following us are blind. And together we'll end up in a ditch somewhere, whatever that looks like in today's life. But it's a warning to be careful of who we follow blindly. Now, in the Science of Mind, we teach everyone to put your full trust and faith in God, universal intelligence. This isn't to minimize the importance of a spiritual center, of ministers, leaders, things like that, but it's important to continually look at our mind and for us as ministers to invite in more wisdom. We don't want you blindly following anything that we say. We don't want you to think we're on the right path and so you just follow us and you should do that too. We want you to think for yourself. And in Matthew 23, 5 times Jesus called out the Pharisees for being blind. Here's what he said: "You make astute arguments, but you're perverse in your actions. And that is a blindness of your heart and mind." He said the Pharisees, when they place items on the altar in the temple, they're doing it to get the grace of God. And he chose this one, you know, the little herb, mint, that you plant in your garden. He said the Pharisees place a lot of mint, but they measure it out very carefully when they put it on the altar. And Jesus said it's right to weigh the mint carefully. But what you forget about weighing is your actions. because you neglect love, mercy, and faith. So they'll weigh out this little herb, mint, that has very little value, and then they go about their ways, forgetting about the other characteristics of God. Jesus told the Pharisees, "You are like a man drinking water. You pour it through a sieve because you don't want the smallest gnat to end up in your water. But then you go out and you swallow a whole camel, hair, horns, and all." I know it's a little gross, but I think he meant it that way. And then he said, "You Pharisees, you clean your crockery that you cook with and serve meals on, but you forget that the food you put on those plates was purchased in fraud, taken from other people." Interesting to think about, isn't it? He said they were indifferent and blind to the morality of their acts. I don't know. If I was a Pharisee, I wouldn't have stuck around for all these things, but but in the Bible they did. Jesus was very wise, but all of these sayings apply to us today. So I was reading about blind spots, because often we don't know where we're blind in something. And this one article said, in psychological analysis, it's believed that if a therapist is analyzing a person who comes to them and finds out that this person has an unconscious hatred for their father, if the therapist has the same issue, they should just stop right there. It's because the therapist has a block about that. They aren't able to clearly see the block in themselves in order to help someone else. Now, when I first went to the eye doctor many years ago, he stuck up this little wand with a little circle on the end of it, and he said, "Tell me when you don't see the end of this wand." And there was this spot. If you ever had that, he holds it up and there's one spot. You cannot see the end of that wand. It's a real blind spot. And I thought that was quite amazing. But if we have a significant emotional event that happens in our life and we don't heal that energy, we can develop a blind spot about that. It's called an intellectual blind spot. It means we can't think about something clearly where we have a significant emotional event that has not been healed. And that's what Jesus meant when the blind lead the blind, they end up in a ditch. You may have at some time met someone you thought was highly intelligent, and then they go do something and you go, "Does she not have common sense?" Anybody have? Yeah, here's a person you highly admire, highly intelligent, and they do something, you go, where is their common sense? But if you could move away and open up subconscious mind, I bet you would find a whole mental, emotional life that was buried, that created this block. So for that one item, they couldn't think straight about it. May just be one particular subject. I was married at 19 and married for 21 years before getting a divorce and moving to California. But my first husband was from Germany, his whole family. They came over when my husband was 10 years old. He was extremely smart, one of the smartest people I have ever met. And yet when it came to talking with people, communicating with people, he would sometimes unconsciously say things that hurt their feelings. He had an emotional bias that when he knew something was right, it was right, period. Then I found it was ingrained in his whole family. Oh, yeah. Yeah. His parents, his brothers, his sisters, they were all very outspoken about when something was right, and they would ridicule each other if they did something wrong. The need to be right was greater than the need to have compassion. Now, I was a space cadet when I was a teenager. I was learning things from these people. I had never eaten butter, real butter, before I met these people. I didn't know that you should clean your fingernails before I met these people. They were wonderful people because they knew what was right. So I was soaking it all up. I became a great observer a great observer, and I never took offense at what they said because I thought, hey, they know what's wrong, they know what's right. But in truth, before they moved to the U.S., they lived in Latvia, and when the Russians came to invade, they walked to Germany, and they lived in Germany during the war. And, you know, during and even after the war, when you do the slightest wrong thing, your life is in danger. True danger. So they knew they had to do things right. They had to. But it was also impactful many years later, war long gone, but the emotional impact was there. And then my husband married me, and his brother married another gal, and we were daughter-in-laws. And whenever my husband and I visited my in-laws, they would always say, oh, you won't believe what Sandy's doing, the other daughter-in-law. Sandy's doing this, and Sandy's doing that, and Sandy. And they would never ask me one question, what I was doing. We lived in Columbus, I was going to college, never asked me one question. So I would have to, when somebody took a breath, I would have to, oh, by the way, here's what I'm doing. And they would go, okay, and then they would go back to whatever they were talking about. And after a couple of years, I got Sandy aside and I said, you know, whenever we go to the in-laws, all they tell me is how great you are and what good things you're doing. And she said, what? Every time I go to the in-laws, they talk about you. We had a big laugh about that. So I'm preparing this talk and I'm thinking, okay, Miss Practitioner, what's the cause of this? Oh, crap, this is going to be a learning experience. And actually, it's been a healing experience for me. It healed something that happened many years ago, because Paul and I have been together 25 years. And I think it was the fear that if they asked me things about what was going on with me, they didn't have the trust that they'd be able to tell me where I was wrong. Do you get that? Especially when I was married to their son. How could you tell your daughter-in-law she's doing something wrong? So they never asked. Never. And I thought, that's an interesting blind spot, isn't it? But it permeated our whole relationship. It was interesting. It was easier for them to just not ask, and they could feel comfortable that they weren't insulting me. Now, I can see that the war took a very heavy emotional toll on their psyche, on their emotional well-being. And all those years, I became a good observer. And this is way before Eckhart Tolle. I learned how to be in the present moment and not feel judged by them because they would never tell me anything about me. They would never ask me anything or share anything about me. So I was never judged. I was like just this quiet person in the corner. So I learned to be a great observer. I watched, I listened, because there's always more to the story than meets the eye. But today, when people get frustrated with my silence, that's my blind spot. It's like the other day, Sue and I were talking, and finally, I was listening, and she finally said, Mary, what do you think? Oh, you want to know? Oh, okay. It's a funny thing. I learned this just this week. So these blind spots permeate our lives in one way, shape, or form. I imagine we all have one. But it also surfaces in religious conflicts. The need to be right. There are people in here, the religious systems that need to be right, and you are wrong. Like my neighbors always tell us that. And it gives them the right to feel intolerant, to criticize, and condemn others. It's really a trick that the mind plays. And yet, from our point of view, we believe in oneness. We believe that we're all in this world as individual creations of the one God. Oneness. You know, it's been a staple of Eastern religions for thousands of years, but it's still a challenge here in our country in many ways. Now, I don't think we're wrong. If my neighbors tell me I'm wrong, I don't think I'm wrong. I'm not going to argue with them. They believe what they believe. But I feel that the full intelligence of God, that I call infinite intelligence, permeates everything that we do. And we're either aware of it and use it and work with it or not. But when we're aware of it, it can overcome any negative energies that we may be feeling throughout the day. And that allows us to be more tolerant ourselves, more compassionate, because we are on this evolutionary spiral of upward intelligence, upward learning. That's why we're lifelong learners here. And every once in a while we might get stuck by one of these blind spots. Sometimes we can find ourselves in a place where, Holmes said it this way, our minds blindly grope in the dark, searching for answers. Ooh. So another article I read this week was on conversational blind spots, which I think my husband had. But you might recognize some of these in other people, of course. Holding the assumption that others see what we see, feel what we feel, and think what we think. Major blind spot. Failing to realize that our own fear and distrust changes how we interpret reality. The inability to stand in another person's shoes when we're upset. And assuming that we remember what other people say when actually we're only remembering what we think about what you say. That's a good one. You assume I remember what you say when I'm really remembering what I think about what you're saying. I think a few can relate. Yeah, it's a blind spot. That's okay, but if we can see it, especially in things that count for something in our life, things that we are feeling are important in our life, that's good to know. And so that's why we as spiritual teachers, leaders, whatever, all the practitioners, all the ministers in our whole organization don't set themselves up as the great example. Instead, we try to be humble and walk the path of truth. This is how we find our way home, with Spirit. Now, Holmes, I love Holmes. He wrote about Matthew 15:14 in the textbook. And he said we must be very careful of the thoughts we're following. We should test all ideas to see if they're really true. It's a mistake to take anyone's opinion just because it sounds plausible. He says, be on guard against accepting that which is not true because the truth is always simple. You know, we live in an amazing time of fake news. You didn't hear that? These are false ideas, heaped upon false ideas, heaped upon false ideas, and it just makes bad matters worse. And it can be real challenging to discern what's true or not. I find that for myself. Who is telling the truth on this? And for me, the bottom line is I ask myself, do I want to believe them just because I want it to be true? Do I want it to be true because it hurts someone? Do I want it to be true because it helps someone? And I think that one, do I want it to be true because it hurts someone, sometimes gets rampant in the media. But recently, you may have heard the term McCarthyism. It came out of the 1950s and has come to be defined as defamation of character by means of widely publicized indiscriminate allegations, especially on the basis of unsubstantiated charges. That's the definition in Wikipedia. Widely publicized, indiscriminate allegations, especially on the basis of unsubstantiated charges. Well, who was this guy, McCarthy? Well, he was a senator in 1950, Joseph McCarthy, and he came to national prominence when he gave a speech and he claimed to have a list of 205 State Department employees who were members of the Communist Party. Now, after World War II, that was a big deal. That was a really big deal. And he said these communists embedded in the State Department are helping to run our foreign policy. Well, finally, they did hearings in March 1954 with the advent of television. My parents had this little 8-inch black and white, but it would only work if it was set a foot from the wall, looking at the wall, so we were always watching television. But I don't want to detract from this because my parents could not stop watching this. There were 57 days of gavel-to-gavel coverage on 2 national TV channels investigating this accusation of communists in the State Department. And in the end, all charges proved not to be true. But it riveted the whole world. So it contributed to Senator McCarthy's downfall, and the Senate censured him, and he went downhill from there. But to me, that's amazing that we can get so caught up in and not test things that are just thrown out there, and subconsciously or consciously, we hope people get hurt. Boy, it's something to really think about. Now, personally, I don't want to get caught by fake news, so I'm really curious. Paul thinks I'm a little weird on that part, but every day I read the Record Searchlight, the Red Bluff Daily News, the Wall Street Journal. I check out various news websites of all persuasions on the internet. I read The Week magazine, which has multiple opinions on items. I read Time magazine, and I read the Imprimis newsletter. And at the end of the week, I think I kinda know what's probably the truth. Kinda. I'm not gonna judge it, but I think I kinda know. But mostly my curiosity is about how's it gonna turn out? Because I'm just one person, I can't change the world, but I can write lots of letters. And so I have no control, but I'm encouraged when in the political arena, people do start working together. Oh, it feels so good. And then when they don't, it just looks like a mess. And it can get really ugly. So I send letters, put them out in the universe, and hope some good comes of it. This is why I'm so glad I found the science of mind, also called religious science. Because if I lived in fear and anxiety, I would have to believe in the duality of the nature of God. I would have to believe in evil and good. And if I did, what a mess that would make of my life. I have to believe God is good all the time. We have our own choices about how we do things. We have our own choices about how we treat people. But in the end of the day, I want to feel confident. I think I know what's going on, and I'm putting my best foot forward in whatever way I can. And so God, expressed as you, has every opportunity every day to share in this knowledge of oneness. To don't go off falling in a ditch following someone whose beliefs take you in a place that is negative, in a place that tears down the world instead of lifts it up. Every one of you can cast out the darkness. And maybe others may help you realize where that is. Sometimes we need someone like Sue to say, "What do you think?" to realize there's a spot there that can be healed. So this was a very healing talk for me. And I appreciate you listening, and I hope it gives you some food for thought this week. So Judy, if we can offer a prayer for this. Oh, I'm smiling instead of crying. Hallelujah. This is the greatest teaching in the world. This is the greatest teaching in the world because it shows you how important you are to God. How important you are to this community, to the greater community, to the world. You are here on purpose, divine purpose. Whatever you think, whatever you say, whatever you do contributes to that goodness. Let us know that we all do that the best we can. And in those times when we are less than, let us read some spiritual literature, meet with spiritual people, take a class to lift us back up. No more ditches, no more walking in ditches. Walk in the path of light and love, joy and happiness. It's ours by divine right if we accept it and use it and multiply it. I'm so grateful. This life is amazing. And so it is.